My name is Natalie. I am a speech and language therapist by trade, and I work at the Feeding Trust charity. And I'm here today to talk to you about children's feeding development, but specifically, obviously, with relation to your little people. In Nicola's case, he's a big person now.
I've muted you.
Muted me there, yeah, brilliant.
Sorry, it was someone came in and I muted to try. Apologies.
Fabulous. I'm not going to spend a long time talking about what we do at the charity because you can always go away and have a look at that yourself. And we are on a limited amount of time. And feeding is a really, really, it's a really big topic. Basically, there's a lot to cover. But my starting place really is always, I think, your experience as parents, because I think you guys, unfortunately, are at the coalface of really struggling with your children's feeding sometimes, and very much that I recognise and we recognise at our charity that it's really hard work, and very often parents are not heard, they're not believed, they're not listened to. And it's really difficult to manage when you've got a child with feeding difficulties. But our starting point for you is always, it's not your fault, guys. I can absolutely guarantee you. I know often it feels like everyone around you is doing an amazing job, and everyone else possibly finding it easier, but it's not your fault. And there's a lot of things going on. And hopefully what we'll go through today will actually help you understand maybe some of those things that are going on, and why your child may be struggling with their feeding development. But a kind of good place to start really is maybe some of the things that you might have been told, or you might have heard. And it's this idea that feeding is really automatic and easy because it's the body's number one priority. We can all do it. It's we have to do it to live, so therefore we all will always do it. Your child will always do it. But actually, feeding and eating actually comes down as about number 4 on the body's list of priority, after breathing and after avoiding pain, and also after this is a weird one, postural stability. You kind of think, what on earth is that all about? But postural stability is literally knowing where your head is in space and kind of feeling like keeping your head safe. And actually, for a lot of our children with Down syndrome, postural stability is a real challenge for them when they're younger and when they're growing up, and they have to work really extra hard to maintain that postural stability, and that will actually override their appetite, and that will override their need to eat. So feeding is actually quite a way down. Go back again. This idea that children will always eat when they're hungry. Had this one literally today from a GP that told the mum that actually, basically, just starve the child because he will eat when he's hungry. And it's up to you how hard you want to push it. That was his exact words. How hard do you want to push it? And, he'll eat eventually. He won't starve himself. Really outdated, unhelpful advice from a GP there. Because we know actually that there are a small portion of children who actually will not and can't eat, even if they are hungry. And there's a lot of reason for that. But things like dysregulation, sensory and emotional dysregulation will really override hunger cues. Many children won't recognise they're hungry. Some children don't have the skills to actually be able to feed themselves, and of course they will always avoid pain over hunger. And a lot of our children, of course, have got constipation and reflux and things, which is painful. So feeding is not up there. And as much as we might think, and again, this is something that doctors will often tell you, that feeding and eating is instinctive, it is only instinctive for the first few months of life. And that sort of swallowing reflex is only instinctive for the first few months of life. And actually, for some of our children with Down syndrome, even when they're born with their neuromuscular differences, and that is really hard. Even when it's instinctive, it's still really difficult. But certainly from around sort of the age of 4 months, developmentally there's a change in the brain, and actually feeding comes under the infant's kind of control. It's no longer instinctive, and that's often when parents really start reporting and seeing, my child's having difficulty, because the child's actually realizing, and then they're no longer just automatically doing it due to an instinct, that they're avoiding it because it's difficult. So, we know, particularly with children with Down syndrome, that eating differences and feeding differences are extremely common. So up to 80% of children with Down syndrome will experience difficulties in the first year of life. 50% will have actual swallowing difficulties. So that's the sort of dysphagia side where they have an unsafe swallow. And periods of nasogastric feeding are really common in infancy. And we know that the feeding difficulties can actually persist throughout their life. And there's a really high prevalence in children under 7 with Down syndrome. And we also know that nutritional risk is often underestimated, because actually if a child's growth is okay, GPs have this thought that, oh, they're growing okay, therefore that they're fine. But actually we know that a lot of our children are nutritionally, even though their growth might be okay, nutritionally they're actually quite at risk due to challenges with getting enough variety in, which has long-term sort of growth, health and social implications. So of course what we're seeing is, if your child has got learning differences, so they've got, they'll have delays in learning to walk, learning to talk, learning to do all those other sort of childhood developmental sort of milestones, actually they're going to have difficulties with and differences with their feeding development as well, because feeding has to develop in the same way as those other things. So we would expect to see some feeding differences. As I said, it's absolutely nothing about anyone doing anything wrong. It's just learning differences equal feeding differences. And we know it has a big impact on day-to-day functioning and quality of life, and because there's no getting away from it. If you've got a child with feeding differences and difficulties, it's every day, every hour of every day of the week, and it's really, really difficult to get away from. So it's really hard. So one of the things that we try and do at our charity is to try and help explain why learning to eat is actually so difficult for some children. Is actually because there are lots and lots of things going on that will impact on a child's ability to learn to eat. And I'm going to keep on coming back to this again and again, because very often we're not talking about, child having feeding disorders or, real medical problem with their feeding. Often we're just talking about their development, and their development being impacted and affected by these different things. And when these different things around our infographic here are interrupted, the child's ability to learn to eat is interrupted as well, and that's when we see feeding differences emerging. So we're going to spend a little bit of time quickly just going around each of these areas and thinking about how all these different areas will impact on your child's ability to learn to eat, and sort of specifically with in relation to your child having sort of Down syndrome and what that might look like, what those differences might look like. So first up, we've got your child's oral motor skill development. That's obviously quite an obvious one, isn't it? You need your mouth muscles. And we know that with children with Down syndrome, that lower muscle tone will impact on the skills needed for eating, drinking, but also saliva control as well. And that can be quite difficult, making them quite sort of dribbly. And that's often made more difficult by what we see, this reverse swallow pattern. So that's when the tongue often comes forward in the mouth rather than naturally sort of sitting further back. So you might have heard people talking about a tongue thrust, but it's just the tongue coming forward rather than back in the mouth. And of course, that can really make feeding and eating and drinking much more difficult, kind of pushing the food out or having difficulties with lip closure. And we've talked about children going through periods of NG feeding, and we know that does impact on their ability to manage oral feeding. And you'll also see, particularly, for example, if there's been periods of NG feeding or things, what you get is an impact. Their experience of sort of food exposure looks different. So we get this thing where maybe they're having difficulties, and we very, very frequently see quite a hypersensitive sort of gag reflex. And when your child gags, it's quite a scary thing. It's not a nice thing to see. So we probably don't offer that food again because we're worried that it's going to make them gag. But then they get reduced experience of those different textures. And reduced experience means reduced opportunity for skill development. And that then, of course, impacts on their sort of oral sensory motor development. They don't have the skills due to lots and lots of repeated practice, and the children's diet becomes increasingly limited, and that gag reflex kind of stays in place. So you get this kind of vicious circle of kind of this exposure opportunity sort of cycle that we'd call it. And it's difficult, and you kind of get trapped in that cycle a little bit, and it's really hard to get out of. But really common, we see these a lot with our children with Down syndrome and feeding differences. This is a massive one, sensory processing. Obviously, we've all got sensory systems, and our senses pick up the information from the environment, but also from inside our body as well. And that information is turned into signals that travel to our brain, and our brain has to interpret these signals and know what information is important and know what information to ignore. So I can hear outside my dogs are making annoying noises and bits and pieces, but I can block that out because I know that's not important information at the moment. I don't need to respond to that. I need to focus my attention on what's happening here. And that's my sensory processing system being able to work out what information I need and what information I don't need. But children with Down syndrome can have very, very different sensory processing systems, and actually the way their brains are interpreting those signals can be, they can have quite sort of different sort of profiles. And eating is the most complex sensory experience we do. So we can see how actually a disruption in the sensory system will really impact on feeding skills and development. And actually what we'll have to think about, I'm not going to go through all of this now, because there is, I think, Nicola, you do a talk on sensory processing anyway, but thinking about it in relation specifically to feeding, obviously we know that eating is a wildly sensory experience in terms of the taste, the smells, the textures, what food looks like. But there's also three really big areas that will impact on your child's feeding development. And these other three senses that are sort of the lesser known senses, I sometimes kind of call them like the internal senses, but they are our vestibular, proprioception, and interoception senses. Now, the vestibular sense, and that's actually our sense of balance and coordination. Now, I don't know if you remember right at the very beginning, we talked about that postural stability being really, really high up on the brain's priority. If your child's vestibular system is either overactive or underactive, their sense of balance and coordination will be impacted. And that massively impacts on their ability to sort of sit still, stay upright, but also coordinate their movements for eating and drinking. Proprioception is our perception of kind of body posture and movement, and also muscle force and effort. So to kind of give you a nice example of that, I've got a glass of water here in front of me that's full. And I know my sense of proprioception tells me how much force I need to hold on to that glass, and then how to bring it up to my mouth. And I know where my mouth is without looking. And that's my proprioception. It's giving me that information through my muscles and joints. And you'll often see with children, you can see when they've got difficulties with proprioception, because you'll find they're very, very heavy-handed with things maybe. So if you give them a crayon they're like, almost ripping holes in the paper, because their sense of being able to kind of work out how much muscle force they need to use is impacted. Now, of course, if you think about that, when we're biting and we're chewing or we're using cutlery, our sense of proprioception is really important. And if we've got differences there, that massively impacts on things. And then the final internal sense is interoception, and that's our recognizing your bodily signals like hunger, thirst, pain, bowel and bladder. And if your sensory processing of interoceptive signals is impacted, that has a huge impact on your digestion and your appetite, knowing when you're hungry, etc. So really, really big area. Next around our infographic is our fine motor skills and self-help skills. So low muscle tone makes the fine motor skills that we need for eating more challenging. So things like, short, chunky handle cutleries, our children will find easier to use because they're easier to grip hold of, and to coordinate their movements with. But we really need to be aware of the impact of fatigue on the ability to eat and drink. And actually, when fine motor skills are developing and children are struggling with those, they tire very easily. The muscles get tired, but also from a cognitive point of view, the brain will get tired of trying to work out how to do that. And when things are they're much more difficult, that will really impact on appetite as well, because it's common sense, isn't it? If something is hard, if it's difficult, you're not going to persevere with it. You're going to avoid doing it because it's really difficult. So we know that difficulty can really increase the avoidance and distraction techniques that we see. So a lot of our children, they love the throwing or the spitting and that sort of thing. We quite like using a finish box at our charity, and we find a finish box a really, really helpful sort of strategy to use when we've got children that are throwing or spitting. And it's literally just I'll often just use a plastic bowl, actually. And when children go to throw something, you sort of intercept with the bowl. You're, oh, brilliant! You've put it in the finish bowl. Well done. And you actually reinforce that throwing as if they finished, and it goes in the finish box when they're finished. And that's a really, really good way of actually breaking that cycle of throwing and spitting things out, because actually you're reinforcing them for doing something good. Oh, you finished with that. You put it in the box. Well done. And it's no longer an avoidance and a distraction strategy that they're using. So finish boxes are really, really helpful. And there's just a nod there to be wearing of messy food play. So this links in with hand skills for fine motor, but also it links in really, really strongly with the previous slide about sensory processing. Quite often, parents are told when they've got a child who's learning to eat or maybe has feeding difficulties, just try messy food play, do some messy food play, sort of as a bit of a fix all of everything. But actually, just generic messy food play can be really, really overwhelming and quite traumatic, actually, for some of our children, because it's, from a sensory perspective, it can be so overwhelming. And it's also quite a meaningless activity. It's not got any purpose to it. So we always avoid generic messy food play, and whilst we do encourage a very, very playful and relaxed approach with food, we don't ever advocate for generic messy food play, and we will talk a little bit later about what we would suggest instead. A big one for our children, we need our feet to eat. So seating posture and positioning is huge. It has a big impact on hand skills, on swallowing and concentration, because meal times use so many muscles in our body, and they do require a lot of strength, speed and stamina from those muscle groups. So we know that a lot of our children will struggle with maintaining that sitting balance or static balance, even, standing still and sitting still. So we really need to think about how we can support children to actually maintain that good position. And again, we'll talk about that a little bit later. But a big thing is actually just having their feet on the floor or their feet supported on even a step or a bit of wood or something, anything, because that will have a bottom-up approach that will really, really support a lot of their other skills. Medical and nutritional factors will have a huge impact on a child's digestion and their appetite, and therefore their willingness to eat. Reflux is a really, really common problem that we see a lot of, and it's often something that is not taken seriously enough, I think, by medical professionals. But reflux can have a really negative impact on a child's experience with food, and it can really, really put them off eating because it's painful. It's acid reflux, and if it's constantly coming up, that does cause inflammation. It causes discomfort. We really, really advocate for our families to be listened to by their GPs when they're and to get them to the GPs and the paediatricians to take that reflux seriously and try and get a hold of it. Because if you're going to leave them just to grow out of it, how long do we leave them to grow out of it? And I'm sorry, if they're 3, 4, 5 years old and they're still really struggling with reflux, that's damage you're doing there. So we really need to get on top of that. But it's difficult to maintain adequate nutrition for growth when there are medical factors such as reflux or allergy on top of the existing motor challenges as well. There are some great nutritional sort of vitamin and mineral supplements that we can use that can really, really support. But if your child is missing whole food groups, so they're not having any fruit or any veg or any protein, for example, that's certainly when we would suggest you seek advice on supplementation from a dietitian, for example, because you will be missing sort of micronutrients. But what I would also strongly say here is there are no food police at our charity. Food is just food, and all food will provide some nutritional value, and it provides calories for growth. So if your child is struggling to get a varied diet, just take that guilt away in terms of just thinking, I'm a bad parent, I'm not giving them a really, really varied diet. If your child is really struggling and they're only managing a restricted number of foods and of a restricted variety, at the end of the day, that is effectively what's keeping them going. So you've got to accept that's where they're at the moment, and don't feel blame and don't feel guilt over that's what they're eating, and then look at how you can support experiences with food in different ways, rather than trying to change what they're eating during meal times because you're worried it's not healthy enough, because that can be really, really hard, and it puts pressure on you and it puts pressure on the child. And the one thing we know that is pretty much guaranteed to put children off their willingness to try new food, and that's pressure. The more pressure we put them under, the less likely they are to do it, and that's something that we see time and time again. Next around our infographic is sleep and toileting. Sleep is such a big one, and the impact of sleep and on our energy levels, and on appetite regulation and a child's willingness to participate. We know ourselves when we're really, really tired, we don't have the energy to be able to actually really do those difficult things. We just want to go with the path of least resistance. We want to go with the easy things. And if we kind of have in our back of our mind that actually eating is difficult for a lot of our children, they find it hard work, and sometimes it can be painful and uncomfortable as well. If you add sleep problems to that, and a lot of our children do have disrupted sleep, and then if you add constipation to it and difficulties with toileting and things like that, it really, really adds to the complication factor we know it has a huge impact on the child's ability to learn to eat and their willingness to eat. So again, it's one of those things that we would always say, yeah, absolutely take these things seriously. And there are a couple of great charities there in the links that can support with sleep and with constipation as well. But again, it's, if your child needs medical management with constipation, again, it's worth going back to the GP and trying to get some support for that constipation, because we do know it has a big impact on children's ability to eat. And then there's the impact that your child's feeding and eating difficulties will have on the whole family, really, and on family routines and how we all think about eating and drinking. When children have feeding difficulties, it impacts on all of our routines. And we do know that when routines become disrupted, appetites become disrupted as well. So when children, for example, are grazing rather than eating meals, they're often they're not getting sort of the hunger and fullness cues that come with having a full stomach after a big meal, and then having a period of hours when you're not eating, and then you go hungry, and then you have a full stomach again for another meal. And so that their appetite does become impacted by that sort of grazing routine. But it's really difficult to try and challenge that grazing routine when your child is not able to come to the table and is not able to participate in a big meal. And that's really hard. It's relentless for both the child and for the parent as well. But as I said, what we do know is the whole bring in the negotiator. It does feel like sometimes that mealtimes become a bit of a battleground. And especially if you add to the challenge that a lot of our children with Down syndrome will have speech and language delays and differences, which means they've got difficulties communicating with you and explaining what's going on, how they're feeling about the food or why they're finding it difficult. And you can feel like a little bit of a negotiator there sometimes, trying to negotiate with your child to get them to eat something. And that's hard as well, because as I said, referring back to previous slide, one of the things that can happen is we inadvertently end up putting sort of children under pressure to try, because we're desperate to get them to eat right, understandable. But we know that any sort of pressure that we put children under will often have an adverse impact in sort of, and it doesn't encourage them to eat, and often it puts them off more. And that's really, really hard to manage that. And it makes it kind of makes us feel even worse. But again, I'll reference you back to what I said right at the beginning, guys. This isn't your fault. You're just doing the best you can in a difficult situation. Which leads us nicely on to the last one, which is the kind of the social and emotional side of things, where it's exhausting and it's hard work having a child who has got consistent mealtime difficulties, and it's quite traumatic for the child, and it's quite traumatic for you guys as parents. And we really need to recognize that in ourselves, and you guys need to look after yourselves and recognize that actually that trauma will be impacting on you, but that trauma will also be impacting on your child. And we know that there's a huge relationship between anxiety and what happens with the gut and digestion. When there is pain involved as well, which there can be if you've got reflux, if you've got constipation, if you've got food allergies, often there can be some sort of pain things. Avoidance of pain can become sort of like a trauma trigger as well. So it's very difficult managing those really, really big feelings for the child, but also it's recognizing that it's also traumatic and difficult for you guys as parents, and you need to take some time out for yourselves, because it does have an impact on you as parents, but also on the whole kind of family dynamics and things, because socially, eating out, going to family parties, Christmas parties, events, birthday parties, or what have you, it can impact on everything when you've got a child that's struggling with eating. And you need to give yourself some space. That's so it's okay. You can't you can't fix everything, and it's not your fault. And to take some time out for yourselves. So that's a whistle-stop tour of why learning to eat can be so very, very difficult. It's a lot to try and get across in just a few minutes. But I'm conscious of the fact that you'll all be sitting here going, yeah, and so what do we do about that now? Yes, tick, 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 tick. We get all of that. What can we do? You know, in 10 minutes, obviously I can't give you and I don't have a magic wand. You've got a QR code there. We've got some resources and bits and pieces on our website, but there are some general principles that we always kind of say underpin everything what we need to think about when we're thinking about your children's feeding, and sometimes just reframing the way you think about your child's eating and feeding, and helping to understanding the problem and realizing that your child's eating is not reflective of your parenting. You know, you could be the absolute best parent in the world, and they can still have feeding difficulties, and that's not, you know, that's no reflection on your ability to parent. It's because feeding is complicated and difficult and painful sometimes. But it is a dynamic developmental journey that your child is going on. And just as they're learning to talk and they're learning to walk, you know, read and write, all those things, all of that will look different. So will their feeding journey as well. And so we need to recognize that they are going on a journey, and it might well look different. But what we do need to respect is their autonomy within that journey as well. So allow them the opportunities to learn in a way that actually kind of respects their individual differences and allows them to be as independent as possible within their sort of developmental ability. And a big part of that feeding development is feeling safe, and feeling safe in that sense of what we call felt safety. So when children don't feel safe in terms of their sensory systems, they're dysregulated, or they're in pain, or they're finding something really, really difficult, that is going to really challenge their ability to learn to eat. So being able to actually help them to be well regulated, and to kind of feel like they can just have a go in a way that is right for them, that actually is really, really, really important. So we always take a very, very sort of low pressure approach that doesn't put any big demands on the child to comply, because that kind of goes against that feeling of felt safety. And also it's dysregulated for you as parents as well, because it's, if your cortisol levels are constantly up here, you don't feel safe, and you're always in fight or flight as well. So, you know, you need to be listened to and regulated and looking after yourselves as well, because it's hard. So the key strategies, then we've got four key strategies that we're going to go through just very, very briefly, and these link in with those areas around the infographic that I spoke to you about. So the first thing we're going to talk about is that the sensory system. It's a huge, huge area, but when we talk about children being dysregulated and being in fight or flight mode, you know, these children who when they're at meal times, they're really dysregulated, really upset, they're finding it really, really challenging. So they're what we would call kind of over responding. So, you know, they're over aroused, they're too alert, they're upset, they're stressed out. Or at the other end, we have our children who are really sort of very, very passive, maybe very, very sort of floppy, low muscle tone. That's really we need to kind of wake those muscles up, and they're under responding, and they're finding it difficult to engage because they're a bit too tired, and they're a bit too under aroused. And when we are learning to do something, and eating, as we've said, it's a developmental process, it's something they've got to learn to do, they need to be in this what we call just right state. And the best way to do that is actually to get them well regulated, because if they are well regulated, they can use their front brain, if you like, and that's where all the thinking and the problem solving and the learning goes on. But actually, when children are in that fight or flight mode. They are in that real sort of brainstem early reactive and really they're having those big sensory reactions, or they're having those big motor reactions, like they're getting up and running away, or they're having those big sensory, like with those gag reflexes and things like that. Or going through to their midbrain, where it's they're feeling very, very emotional, they're feeling worried about things. If they are operating in those kind of brain states, if you like, they can't access that higher level thinking that they need in order to learn. And if we go back to eating as a learning process, children actually need to access, they need to be learning in their frontal lobe. So they need to be well regulated so they can actually access that part of their brain which does the complex learning of new skills. And the best way to do that is actually through movement and using proprioceptive movement in particular. So proprioception is what we call the kind of magic sense, as it has a really, really regulating effect on the nervous system. And probably one of the best ways I can explain this to you is how, if you are, for those of you that like a massage, and you know, when you're feeling really tense and you're really stressed, and then you go for a massage, you get lots of deep pressure through your muscles, and you come out of there and you're like, oh my gosh, I feel so much better. You feel calmer, you feel relaxed, you feel much, much more better regulated. And a lot of that is to do with that pressure that you've had through your muscles. That is proprioception, pressure through your muscles. So we can do this with children where we actually want them to be actively involved, you know, actively using their muscles for heavy work, so pushing and pulling and stretching. And we can do this. You can think of lots of different ways, but basically, if you're thinking with your child, we often use, with our younger children, for example, we'll use nursery rhymes, like action rhymes. So we'll do marching songs and climbing songs where we're up and down and marching, and we're using some big muscle movements. All of that, you know, 3 to 5 minutes of exercise using that proprioceptive sense before coming to a table or before sitting down to eat, can really, really help regulate a child's nervous system. So we would always say, don't go straight from, for example, sitting down on the sofa, watching TV, or playing on the iPad, and then straight into an eating activity. Put a movement break in first, where your child is using that proprioceptive sense and actively using their muscles to help regulate their nervous system, get them in that just right set state. And that will support them then to use their frontal lobe so they can actually engage it to learn about this complex skill that they've got to master, which is learning to eat. The next one is our eating as learning ladder. So we use this to think about, again, from the sort of the sensory exploration point of view. We're always very, very focused on the top end of this, very, very top of this ladder, which is tasting. We want children to taste and to eat the new foods. But actually, our children have got to go through multiple steps in order to learn all the information they need about new foods in order to feel confident with it, to feel safe to actually put it in their mouth and have a go. So we really encourage using this eating as learning ladder to think about how we can encourage children to interact with food in a really positive way, but without the need to just put it straight in their mouth, in their taste it. Because actually we find a lot of the time, if children go straight into, right, try food, put it in my mouth, they have a big taste, flavour, they don't know, oh my God, what was that? I wasn't expecting it. They gag, and then, oh, it's all gone horribly wrong. But actually, there's a lot of learning they can do about that food. If I've got a carrot, I can look at it and I can describe it. So, look, you know, this is what the carrot looks like. This is what it feels like. Is it crunchy? This is what it sounds like. Oh, it smells. Does it smell sweet? No, it smells savoury. And then I can have a little lick to see what it tastes. We can work our way up the ladder in a really, really kind of steady way. And if you've got a child who's struggling with, touching new foods, that's fine. We can just look at them to start with, and we can actually we can really reinforce the things that they are doing well, even if it's just looking or listening about food, without just focusing on that top rung of the ladder, which is taste. Because the more confident they get with the other rungs up the ladder, and the more they don't feel under pressure to actually, I've got to taste it, I've got to eat it, the more likely they are, we know, to have a go at actually working their way up themselves, especially if they're able to do it themselves and they don't feel under pressure. And a lot of that will come through actually you as the adult modeling it. So rather than expecting them to do it straight away, you just show them with your food, oh, look, I can do this with my food. I can look at it, I can touch it, I can smell it, I can listen to it. Oh, that's very interesting. I can learn all about this food. And they can watch you and observe, but without having that pressure to actually put it in their mouth themselves. So just watching and waiting and listening, and rather than jumping straight in and trying to get your child to taste a new food, talking about what you're doing with your own food and modeling what you're doing with your own food is really, really important. Because again, if we're coming back to thinking about all the different things that children need to learn to do, they've got to learn to use their hands in a coordinated way. They've got to learn to use their mouth in a coordinated way. And don't take it for granted that they'll know automatically how to do these things. They've got to learn just like they learn everything else. And we wouldn't expect a child to learn to talk without modeling with them language. This is how we talk. I'm going to talk to you. I'm going to use words. I'm going to use, symbols. I'm going to use signs. Use lots and lots of different techniques with your child to support them with their speech and language development. We can do exactly the same thing with their feeding development. We can use all sorts of different strategies and support, but we're not going to instantly expect them to eat that new thing straight away. A little bit like, I'm not going to say to a child, what's this? And expect them to say the word straight away. We recognize there's a learning process that children have got to go through. So that links in really, really nicely into what we call our eating as learning language. And so when we're going up that ladder, we're going to use our eating as learning language. And the principles of eating as learning language is that it reduces the pressure on the child. And as I said to you, reducing the pressure is absolutely key, because as soon as they're under pressure, a bit like you, if I'm going to watch you, you've got to do a complex maneuver in your car. I'm going to ask you to parallel park on a busy high street, and I'm going to put 6 people on the pavement, and they're all going to stand there watching you, and they're all going to, give you helpful advice about how best to park. Are you going to park in that spot on the high street with all those people watching you? No, too much pressure. You know what I'm going to do? I'm driving off and I'm finding somewhere else to park. Same principle with learning to eat. We have to reduce the pressure down. And the way we do that is actually by reducing the questions, because questions are demands. So questions like, would you like some of this? Why don't you try some of this? Go on, you'll like it. You like this? Do you like this one? I'm sure you will like this one. All these questions we ask just put pressure on children. And I know we're trying to encourage them, but inadvertently that is putting pressure on. So we need to be objective, and we need to model without expectation. So that means we're going to do and we're going to show, but we're not going to tell children, you have to do this, you have to join in. Okay, so we're going to avoid asking questions, but we're going to talk about our own food, talk about our own interactions, and we're going to model what we're doing with our own food without the expectation they have to join in. You have to put a bit of a game face on, which sounds a bit of a weird thing, but if we have a big reaction to when they actually maybe taste something, again, some children will interpret that as pressure, and then they'll avoid doing it again because I don't want anybody watching me. So you almost have to be a bit nonchalant and pretend like, no, it's no big deal, even though internally you're like, oh, gosh, that's amazing. We really need to try and avoid emotive and opinion-based language, because if I say, oh, that's yummy, that's your favorite, that's lovely, you're going to really like that, what does that actually tell you about the food? Absolutely nothing other than that I like it. And just because I like it doesn't mean you're going to like it. Yeah. So we're going to use descriptive language, and I'm going to tell you what I mean by that in a minute. And we are not going to set out an expectation that they have to eat. Actually, we're going to try and give your child agency and autonomy to have a go and do it themselves. And even if that means making mistakes, not doing things properly, that doesn't matter. They're learning to have a go themselves. And we know that children are far, far more successful if they feel like they've got a choice and they've got a little bit of control. And some of that means not over encouraging. So if you've asked them and you've given them the choice and they've said no, don't keep on going back and just say, oh, are you sure? Maybe just try one little bit. Go on, just have a little bit for mummy. Again, that well-meaning encouragement actually will be perceived as pressure and will really put children off. So you have to become a little bit a bit of a master of describing food in ways that you would never think of describing food. It's not a natural way of talking about food, but actually this is how children will learn all about what it is that eventually we're hoping is going to go in their mouth. So we're going to describe what food looks like. What does it smell like? What does it feel like? What does it sound like even? Is it crunchy? Is it loud? Is it quiet? And then finally, what does it taste like? And all of this information is very, very neutral. It's very, very factual. But it really sort of demystifies food for children so they know exactly what to expect. So if they do have a go, I know if this is wet, if it's got a big smell, if it's really crunchy or if it's really squishy, and know what colour it is, and is it sweet, is it sour, is it savoury. And with a lot of our children, we use symbol supports as well. We don't just use our words. So for your children that are AAC users, great, get those aided language displays, get their symbol cards, get their devices if they've got AAC on a device, and use all of those symbols to support you with describing what the food is like. Because actually that's really a great learning opportunity for your child's feeding development, but it also really supports their speech and language development as well. And bizarrely, we inadvertently often see when we start doing feeding therapy with children, one of the first things we often see is their language development comes on first, because we're using this eating as learning language, and it's mapping lots of lovely new vocabulary to real events in the here and now. But just a very, very quick top tip on this as well. We would always suggest that you don't use the term safe food. So you might have heard people talking about, oh, my child only has these certain safe foods. And it's particularly something you'll see with neurodivergent children and families talking about their children's safe foods to describe the foods that their children prefer to eat. Now, the difficulty with that is, what is the opposite of safe? It's unsafe or it's dangerous, which actually is quite a harmful message to send children, that the foods they don't eat are somehow bad for them or dangerous and might harm them in some way. So rather than using the term safe food to describe your child's preferred foods, we would always advocate for you using the term same food instead. And that's because you like these foods, that they're the same, and we're having some foods that are different, and that's fine. It's non-judgmental. We've got same and different foods, but it's a totally different message, and it's one that we can learn about different foods, but they're not harmful to us. We talked about postural stability just very, very briefly before, but we know that a lot of children with Down syndrome have got sensory motor differences that can make holding or standing in sort of static positions difficult. So really, it is absolutely key getting a good supportive position and sitting place for your child. But we do know that actually some children struggle with sitting at a table and on a chair. That's fine. Being on the floor, sitting on the floor, as long as your child has a stable base, that is the absolute key, because that stable base underpins all of the other skills, the physical skills above it. So all of the hand skills, the head control, the postural control, the oral motor skills, they will all depend on good postural stability from the core. Right, last little bit. So this is just something that you can do and have a little think about in your own time. I don't know how we're doing for time. Ooh, I've gone over a little bit, but we didn't start from, I think, until about 10 past. But one of the things we know that really, really help is if we can provide a sense of predictability and consistency with mealtime routines, because children find sort of safety and security within routines. So trying to bring some sort of a routine to your meal and snack times is can be really, really helpful. So that just means having a definite beginning, middle, and an end. We've already talked about the beginning. I would always recommend doing a movement-based activity beforehand, and that can be used to signify the start of the activity, getting your child into the just right place. Or you can use sort of a hand washing or transitioning with music and symbols. And then at the end of the mealtime, that idea of using a finish box or a finish bowl or something to signify this has finished now, it just really helps children to kind of feel safe that, okay, that's done now, I'm okay, I can move on, and you're not going to keep on coming back and asking me to do a bit more and a bit more and a bit more. So working within those routines, using visual supports with that and symbols can be really, really helpful as well. And I'm sure some of your children will maybe have sort of, you'll see them using at school or nursery, visual timetables and things, same sort of principle, but bringing that to a mealtime or a snack can be really, really helpful. Having a think about where everyone can sit. So has your child got a suitable seat? And actually, can they sit with you and can you sit with them? Even if that is on the floor, if you're not at a table, you sitting with your child is really beneficial because they get to watch what you're doing. And I know it can be difficult sometimes, but they can learn so much from just watching you eat. And hearing you talk about your food as we've talked, using that language is really, really important. Think about the environment. What else is happening in the environment? Are there other distractions and things that are maybe going on that are sort of pulling their attention away or competing with their attention? Children are having to concentrate on something that's really, really difficult, learning to eat. So actually reducing distractions in the environment can be really helpful. And thinking about what the child is eating. And we would always sort of suggest that you offer them their same food, their accepted food, but always try and offer new foods alongside without that expectation that they're going to eat them. Because actually what you can do as the adult is you can model eating those new foods alongside your child so that they've got an opportunity to look and explore and learn about it, using that eating as learning language and ladder, as we've spoken about. And then we like to use visual supports a lot, and we've talked about maybe aided language displays or symbol supports so that you can have words available to help you talk about what is the food like, you know, what does it look like, what does it smell like, what does it taste like, and supporting your child's learning in that way. And then having that tidy up routine at the end, so we've spoken about, so that you've got a tidy up bowl, and that really symbolises the end of that activity, and that final clearing up at the end really helps add to that sense of safety and security and predictability that can help that learning environment flourish, if you like. And I think that is the biggest whistle stop tour done.